Fred and George Weasley are some of the most beloved characters in the Harry Potter series. It's hard not to love them. I've had so many people ask me to make a video on their life on not just YouTube, but other platforms as well. So I decided to buckle down and finally make this massive video. Obviously, because this video is about two main characters and not just one, it's a bit lengthy. But you guys always say that you prefer the longer videos to the shorter ones, so hopefully that's a good thing. I also wrote this script a bit differently than the other ones because I added literally every detail, because if we're being honest, that's what Fred and George deserve. Before we start, I want to make this very clear. This video is based on the books, not the movies. There is a huge difference, and you'll see just how big that difference is when I go through their life. If you've only seen the films, you're about to hear a completely different story for the twins. That being said, though this is based on the books, as always, I'm going to use clips from the movies just to make it more visually pleasing for you guys. Also, there are obviously going to be spoilers. Now that that's out of the way, let's get this video started. Fred and George were twins who were born on April 1st, 1978 to Arthur and Molly Weasley. Their birthdays being on April Fool's Day would perfectly predict the jokesters that they would later become. Fred was born first and George followed minutes later. Like their parents and the rest of their siblings, they had bright red hair and freckles. They were the fourth and fifth Weasley children, having three older brothers, Bill, who was almost 8 years older than them, Charlie, who was almost 6 years older than them, and Percy, who was 2 years older than them. Later on in life, they would have two more younger siblings, Ron, who was 2 years younger than them, and their one and only sister, Ginny, who was 3 years younger than them. Unlike in the movies where the twins were tall and lanky, in the books they were actually shorter and stockier like their brother Charlie. Because the Weasleys had so many kids, they struggled financially, meaning that almost all of Fred and George's clothes and belongings were hand-me-downs. They grew up in the Burrow, the home of the Weasley family, and the twins shared a room on the second floor. Explosions from their room would happen so often that it was considered to be quite normal. When Fred was 5 years old, a 3-year-old Ron broke his toy broomstick, so to get back at him, he turned Ron's teddy bear into a huge spider, which was actually the start of Ron's terrible fear of spiders. Another time, the twins tried to get Ron to make an unbreakable vow when he was 5, which if you break, you die. Mr. Weasley caught them before they could do it though, and they said it was the only time they had seen their father get as angry as their mother. He ended up spanking the twins, and later on, Fred joked that his left butt cheek had not been the same since. On another occasion, Fred gave a 7-year-old Ron an acid pop, and it burned a hole right through his tongue. This made Mrs. Weasley furious, and she hit Fred with her broomstick. Growing up, the twins were forced to do chores in the garden, one of which was de-gnoming the gardens, and while doing this, they taught the gnomes that came around the Burrow a bunch of swear words. Their Auntie Muriel used to come over every Christmas, but after the twins set off a dung bomb under her chair at dinner, she refused to come for Christmas anymore, and Mr. Weasley was convinced that she wrote the twins out of her will because of this. The twins ended up losing 3 uncles in their childhood, one of which was Muriel's husband, Uncle Bilious, who died after seeing the Grimm. And they also lost their uncles on their mother's side, Fabian and Gideon Pruitt. Fabian and Gideon died like heroes fighting off Death Eaters, and seeing this made Fred and George see how dangerous the world out there was. It wasn't all just jokes and laughs. Having older brothers, Fred and George learned to fly and play Quidditch at a young age, trying to keep up with Bill and Charlie in their backyard, and they became very good. After turning 11 in April, they got their Hogwarts letters the following summer. They headed to school with their brothers Charlie and Percy, and like the rest of their family, they were sorted into Gryffindor. They became friends with fellow Gryffindor Lee Jordan, who was also in their year, and he became the twins' best friend. Fred and George quickly became known for their antics, and though they would get a lot of points taken off for Gryffindor, most didn't care because they were making everyone around them laugh, and also because they were pretty popular and everybody wanted to be their friend. Despite being jokesters, according to Ron, the twins actually got pretty good grades, which not a lot of people know. Fred and George immediately began to explore the castle, and in their first week there, they discovered a secret passageway behind a statue of Gregory and Smarmy. The twins quickly caught the attention of the caretaker Argus Filch, and he wrote them up many times. So many times in fact that they had an entire drawer of write-ups to themselves. One time when running from Filch, they passed the Room of Requirement, the room that turns into whatever you need at that point in time, and for them, it turned into a broom cupboard, and they hid in there to escape from Filch. Another time during their first year, after setting off a dung bomb, they were taken to Filch's office, and there they saw a piece of parchment in a cabinet labeled confiscated and highly dangerous. The young Fred and George knew that they had to have it, so George set off another dung bomb while Fred stole it. Now, one of the most common questions I get asked is how Fred and George learned to open the map, because obviously you need a specific phrase to open it. Luckily for us, Rowling actually answered that. She said that they tried many word combinations, and because the map knew they really were up to no good, the map helped them, flickering into life as they got closer and closer until they finally hit upon the exact right word combination.
I solemnly swear that I am up to no good.
With the Marauder's map, Fred and George discovered all sorts of secrets, like the 7 secret passageways in and out of the castle, where the kitchens were, which of course led them to the discovery of tickling the pear to open the entrance to it so that they could steal food. The map also helped to make sure they didn't get caught while doing many things, because they could see where Filch and any other teachers were at any given moment. This map, as they later say, was the key to their success. When they first got the map, they began to explore the 7 secret passageways, and quickly they found out that Filch knew about 4 of them, so they learned to stay away from those. They also found out that the one behind the mirror on the 4th floor was a good one, but later on down the road it would be blocked off when it caved in. The one they never tried was the one at the entrance of the Whomping Willow, because they didn't think there was a way to get past the crazy violent tree. They discovered that one of the passageways led right into the cellar of Honeydukes in Hogsmeade, and they probably used this passageway more than any of the others. During their second year, the twins tried out for the Gryffindor Quidditch team, and they became their house's beaters. They became incredible beaters, and they were so good in fact that they were referred to as human bludgers. On at least one occasion, Fred and George went into the Forbidden Forest on the Hogwarts grounds, and they were caught, alerting the headmaster Albus Dumbledore of what they had done. The summer after their second year at Hogwarts, they returned home to the Burrow. Their brother Percy, who was starting his 5th year at Summer's End, got an owl saying that he would be a prefect, and he wore his badge day and night and did nothing but talk about it, which sort of annoyed the twins, and they took any chance they had to make fun of him for it. Their younger brother Ron was about to start his first year at Hogwarts, and Fred and George had some fun with him, saying that the way you get sorted into your house was through a test that was very painful. On September the 1st, the twins along with their mother, Percy, Ron, and their younger sister Ginny went to King's Cross Station, and there they met a young boy who asked for help in getting to platform 9 3/4. After helping him, Fred and George played a trick on their mother, making her think that she messed up their names.
Fred, you next.
He's not Fred, I am. Honestly, woman, you call yourself our mother.
Oh, I'm sorry, George.
I'm only joking. I am Fred.
Once they made it to the train, George saw the boy that they had helped struggling with his trunk, and he called Fred over to help. The boy named Harry thanked them, and as he did so, he pushed his hair out of his eyes to reveal a scar. The twins immediately put together that he was Harry Potter, the famous boy who lived. They stared at Harry in disbelief until their mother called them over. When they joined their mother and siblings, they made fun of their younger brother Ron when Mrs. Weasley was wiping dirt off his face. Before saying goodbye, Mrs. Weasley turned to the twins and told them to behave themselves that year, saying that if she got any owls saying that they did something like blow up a toilet, she'd be angry. And Fred and George said that they'd never blown up a toilet before, but looked at each other mischievously and thanked their mom for the great idea. The twins then told their mom and their siblings about how the boy they had helped was Harry Potter, and Fred asked his mom if she thought Harry remembered what you-know-who looked like. This made Mrs. Weasley get stern, and she forbid him to ask him. They then boarded the train, and as their younger sister Ginny began to cry, the twins promised that they would send her loads of owls, and then joked saying that they'd send her a Hogwarts toilet seat, but quickly said that they were joking when Mrs. Weasley got mad. While on the train, the twins went with Ron as he entered a compartment with Harry in it, and they told their younger brother that they'd be in the middle of the train as their friend Lee Jordan had a tarantula. They then formally introduced themselves to Harry, and they introduced Ron to Harry as well. When they got to Hogwarts, the twins watched their younger brother get sorted into Gryffindor, and when Harry Potter was sorted into their house as well, they began to chant, "We got Potter! We got Potter!" As Dumbledore was making his speech before dinner, he noted that first years shouldn't go in the forest, and he then looked at the twins, saying that some of the older students should remember that as well. That year's Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher was Quirnus Quirrell, who had just come back wearing a turban after being in Romania, and the twins insisted that the turban was stuffed full of garlic to ward off vampires that he might have met while he was away. The Gryffindor Quidditch team didn't start out great that year, as they had lost their star seeker when Charlie Weasley graduated 2 years ago, and they had had a terrible season the year before. So when Oliver Wood, the captain of the team, told Fred and George that Harry Potter was the new seeker and that he was really good, the twins got excited. When they saw Harry in the hallway, they approached him and told him that they were the beaters on the team, and Fred said that they'd win the Quidditch Cup for sure that year. During the first match, Harry's broom started going crazy, and a terrified Fred and George flew up to try and pull Harry to safety, but every time they got near him, the broom would jump higher and higher. The twins decided to drop down and prepare to catch Harry if he fell, but luckily his broom stopped going mad and the team won when Harry caught the snitch. Approaching Christmas, Hogwarts was graced with snowfall, and Fred and George took this opportunity to bewitch several snowballs to follow Quirrell around, bouncing off the back of his turban. Knowing what we know now, the twins were actually throwing snowballs at Voldemort's face because, as we find out, he was on the back of Quirrell's head. Fred and George, along with Ron and Percy, decided to stay at Hogwarts that Christmas as their parents were going to visit their older brother. When they woke up, they found the hand-knitted sweaters from their mother, which they got every year. Fred's had a big F on it, and George's had a big G. When they met up with Ron and Harry, they saw that Harry got a sweater from their mother too, and holding it up, Fred jokingly said that their mother made more of an effort if it was for someone that wasn't part of the family. When Ron put his sweater on, they noticed that he didn't have a letter on it, and George said, "I suppose she thinks you don't forget your name. But we're not stupid, we know we're called Gred and Forge." When Percy refused to put his sweater on, the twins forced it over his head, knocking his glasses off. They then said that Percy wasn't sitting with the prefects that day, as Christmas was a time for family. The Weasley brothers, along with Harry, spent the day together, having a furious snowball fight on the grounds, playing with exploding wizard crackers, and eating a magnificent Christmas dinner. That night in the common room, Fred and George stole Percy's prefect's badge, and Percy chased them all over trying to get it back while Ron and Harry roared with laughter. When training for the next match, Fred and George kept dive-bombing each other and pretended to fall off their brooms. Oliver told them to stop messing around and gave them the bad news that Snape would be refereeing the next match, and this made George fall off his broom for real. During the match, George got mad at one of Snape's bogus calls, and he hit a bludger toward him, which granted Hufflepuff a penalty. Despite this, Gryffindor went on to win the game in less than 5 minutes after Harry caught the snitch, and the twins and the rest of the team were ecstatic. After the match, Fred and George went down to the kitchens to steal some food for a party in the Gryffindor common room, and they all celebrated. Toward the end of the school year, Fred, George, and Lee Jordan went down to the lake and tickled the tentacles of the giant squid. Not long after that, Harry was sent to the hospital wing and was passed out for 3 days. To make him feel better when he woke up, Fred and George tried to send Harry a toilet seat, but Madame Pomfrey confiscated it for sanitary reasons. When it came time to head home for the summer, Fred and George, along with the rest of the students, got notes that warned students about using magic outside of school, and Fred said that he'd always hoped they'd forget to give these to them. That summer, Fred and George noticed that Percy was acting oddly, sending a lot of letters and spending loads of time shut up in his room. George joked, saying that there was only so many times you could polish your prefect badge. After not hearing from Harry all summer, Fred, George, and Ron decided to rescue him from his aunt and uncle's house using their father's flying car. When they got there, Fred and George climbed into the house to help Harry get his Hogwarts things, which the Dursleys had locked up in the cupboard down below. George pulled out a hairpin, and Fred told Harry that a lot of wizards think it's a waste of time to know Muggle tricks, but that they felt they were skills worth learning. They used the hairpin to pick the lock and get Harry's trunk. They then just barely escaped. When they arrived back at the burrow, Fred told his brothers to sneak upstairs and wait for their mom to call them down for breakfast so she wouldn't know that they left, and he told Ron to then come down and say that Harry arrived in the middle of the night. However, when they spotted their mother, the twins got very scared. As soon as she saw them, Mrs. Weasley screamed at them. She then said that she never had trouble like this from Bill, Charlie, and Percy, and Fred mockingly said, "Perfect Percy," and Mrs. Weasley said that he could take a leaf out of Percy's book. When Fred and George tried to go to bed after being up all night to get Harry, Mrs. Weasley instead forced them to do chores and de-gnome the garden. After Ron threw one of the gnomes away, Fred said his throw was pitiful and proved that he could throw his way farther. When Mr. Weasley came home, Mrs. Weasley told him what the twins and Ron had done, and she did not get the response she wanted, which made the twins laugh.
How'd it go?
During breakfast the next day, their Hogwarts letters arrived, and Fred noticed that there were a ton of books written by Gilderoy Lockhart, who Fred had previously told Harry that Mrs. Weasley fancied, and after seeing this list of books, he said that the new teacher must be a witch. However, when he caught Mrs. Weasley's angry stare, he busied himself with something else. George then said out loud that that year's books would not come cheap, but Mrs. Weasley told him that they would manage. After breakfast, the twins along with Harry and Ron went to play Quidditch out back, but they could not use real Quidditch balls, so instead they threw apples for each other to catch. The twins were also excited to try out Harry's fancy new broomstick, the Nimbus 2000. When they went to Diagon Alley to get their school supplies, Fred and George went first to show Harry how it was done, but Harry messed up and ended up in Nocturne Alley, and when Fred and George discovered this, they were excited, as they were not allowed to go down there. Later on, Fred and George spotted their friend Lee Jordan, and they went off to hang out with him. They went to Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke Shop, and the twins along with Lee stocked up on Dr. Filibuster's fireworks. Later on, while in the bookstore, Mr. Weasley got into a fight with Lucius Malfoy, and Fred and George cheered their father on. The night before they set off for Hogwarts, Fred and George rounded off the evening with a display of Filibuster fireworks. Fred and George took the train to Hogwarts, and they later found out that Ron and Harry took the flying car to school. When the two entered the common room, Fred and George approached them and asked why they didn't include them. When it came time for the first Quidditch practice of the year, Wood woke the twins and the rest of the team up at the crack of dawn, and while in the locker room, the twins sat there with messy hair and puffy eyes. Wood then lectured them, and as he did so, Fred fell asleep on Alicia Spinnet's shoulder and began to snore. When Wood finally finished, he asked if the team had any questions, and George responded, asking why he couldn't have told them all of this yesterday when they were still awake. When they finally got onto the pitch, the Slytherin team showed up saying that they had the pitch because of their new seeker Draco Malfoy. Fred immediately asked if he was Lucius Malfoy's son, and Draco said yes, then showed off the Slytherin team's new Nimbus 2001s that his father had bought for the team. He then smiled nastily at Fred and George and made fun of their Clean Sweep 5 brooms, which were some of the crappiest brooms you can buy. When Ron and Hermione joined them on the field, Draco called Hermione a mudblood, and the captain of the Slytherin team, Marcus Flint, had to jump in front of Draco to stop Fred and George from tackling him. Oliver later gave Fred and George the mission to spy on the Slytherin Quidditch team during their practices, and they saw for themselves just how fast the Nimbus 2001s were. They told Oliver that the Slytherin team were no more than 7 greenish blurs shooting across the air like missiles. One day, Fred stole a fire-dwelling lizard from a Care of Magical Creatures class, and that night, he and George fed the lizard a filibuster firework with a whole crowd of curious people watching, and the lizard shot into the air, emitting loud sparks and bangs as it whirled wildly around the room. This, however, made Percy scream furiously at the twins. When it came time for their first Quidditch match, Oliver told Harry to get the snitch or die trying, and Fred winked at Harry and said, "No pressure." During the match, it became clear that the bludger had been tampered with to only go after Harry, and the twins made it their job to protect him, but this led to Slytherin taking the early lead. George called a timeout, and when they all met up, Harry told Fred and George to leave him and go back to the game, but Fred told him not to be dumb as it would take his head off, but Harry didn't care. George then looked at Wood and said that this was all his fault for telling Harry to get the snitch or die trying, and George called Oliver stupid for saying that. When they went back to play, Fred and George not protecting Harry led to his arm getting broken, but Harry still caught the snitch but passed out after catching it. Fred and George, seeing that the bludger was still going after Harry even after the game was over and he was passed out, they took it upon themselves to wrestle the ball down and put it back in the box before it hurt Harry, which was not easy. After the match, the twins went to visit Harry in the hospital wing, bringing cakes, sweets, and bottles of pumpkin juice, and George told Harry that his flying was unbelievable in that match. When it became clear that the Chamber of Secrets had been opened, everybody in the school thought that Harry was the heir of Slytherin, which Fred and George found very funny. They went out of their way to march ahead of Harry when walking down the corridors, shouting to make way for the heir of Slytherin. When Christmas came around, the twins and their siblings decided to stay at school, and they had fun playing Exploding Snap in the common room with everyone else gone. During Christmas dinner, the twins bewitched Percy's prefect badge to say Pinhead instead of prefect, which made Ron, Ginny, Harry, and Hermione laugh. Things took a dark turn that year, however, when Hermione and a few others were petrified, and toward the end of the year, Fred and George were horrified to hear the news that Ginny was taken down to the Chamber of Secrets, where they said her skeleton would lie forever. The twins, along with Ron and Harry, sat together in the corner of the common room, unable to say anything to each other. After hours had passed, the twins headed to bed, unable to sit there any longer. Luckily, Ginny was saved by Harry and Ron, and Fred and George could not be more relieved. When it was time to go home for the summer holiday, the twins, along with Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny, got a compartment on the train, and they made the most of the last few hours where they could legally use magic. Ginny then informed them on why Percy was acting so weirdly last summer, telling them that he had a girlfriend, and hearing this made Fred drop a stack of books on George's head. Ginny told him not to tease him about it, and Fred said that he wouldn't dream of it, but he and George looked like their birthday had come early. That summer, the Weasley family won a good amount of gold, and they used the gold to visit Bill in Egypt. Bill gave them tours of old pyramids and tombs, and the twins tried to shut Percy into one of them, but Mrs. Weasley saw this and furiously ensured that it didn't happen. The Weasley family decided to spend the remainder of the summer at the Leaky Cauldron where Harry and Hermione were staying, and when they saw Harry talking to Percy, they elbowed their brother out of the way and started making fun of how proper Percy was when talking, saying, "Harry, simply splendid to see you, old boy. Marvelous, absolutely spiffing." Mrs. Weasley then told them to stop, but they continued saying, "Mum, how really corking to see you." But when Mrs. Weasley cut them off, they realized she was serious and they stopped. Mrs. Weasley then told Harry that Percy was made head boy and that he was the third Weasley child to do so, to which Fred responded saying it would be the last, and Mrs. Weasley angrily said that she didn't doubt that. She then pointed out, frowning as she did so, that Fred and George did not receive prefect badges, as they were going into their 5th year at Hogwarts when prefects were chosen. George then chimed in and asked why they would want to be prefects, as it would take all the fun out of life, and this made Ginny giggle. Mrs. Weasley then scolded the twins, saying that they had to be a better influence for their sister. When they found out that the ministry was sending a couple of cars to take them to King's Cross, Percy asked why, and George jokingly said that it was for him, saying that the cars would have little flags on the hoods with an HB on it for head boy. But Fred then chimed in, saying that the HB would stand for humongous big head, which made everybody except for Percy and Mrs. Weasley laugh. That night, the twins stole Percy's prefect's badge, and they were cracking up as they heard Percy dismantling his and Ron's room looking for it. When they spotted Harry walking by, they showed him that they had changed his head boy badge to now read Big Head Boy. During the first Quidditch practice of the season, Wood hyped the twins up saying that they were unbeatable, and Fred responded saying that Wood was an amazing keeper himself. After Wood said that this was his last chance, as he was in his 7th year, Fred told him that this was their year. When the first trip to Hogsmeade Village arrived, the twins were excited to visit Zonko's joke shop to get more stink pellets. Zonko's was the twins' favorite shop, and it would go on to have a huge impact on them. During another practice, Cedric Diggory, the seeker for Hufflepuff, was brought up, and the 3 girls on the team were raving about how good looking he was and how he was strong and silent, and this made Fred say that he was only silent because he was too thick to string 2 words together. He then said that Hufflepuff was an easy win, as Harry had caught the snitch in 5 minutes last time, but Oliver said that Hufflepuff was better now, and that Fred and George were not taking it seriously, but Fred assured Oliver that they were. Unfortunately, Gryffindor lost to Hufflepuff when Cedric caught the snitch and Harry fell off his broom because of Dementors. Afterwards, the twins stayed by Harry's side in the hospital wing, and when he woke up, they asked how he was feeling. Fred then told him that he had fallen off his broom, and George told him that they had lost. When Harry got really upset, Fred grabbed his shoulder and told him to cheer up, as he'd never missed the snitch before, and George chimed in saying that there had to be one time where he didn't get it. Fred then said that it wasn't over, as they still had a chance to win it all if certain teams won or lost by a certain number of points. As they left, Fred told Harry not to beat himself up, as he was still the best seeker they'd ever had. When the next Hogsmeade trip came, Harry wasn't allowed to go because he didn't get his permission slip signed, but the twins hung back to give Harry a present. They gave Harry the Marauders map that they had stolen from Filch's office in their first year as an early Christmas present.
What's this rubbish?
What's this rubbish, he says. That there is the secret to our success.
Although the map served them well for the past 5 years, they told Harry that he could now benefit from the map more than they could. They told him which passageways worked, which didn't, and which one to take at this moment, leading him right into Hogsmeade. As they walked away, George winked at Harry and said he would see him in Honeydukes. During the next Quidditch match, which Gryffindor had to win to get into the finals, Fred told Harry to show Cho Chang, the Ravenclaw Seeker, his speed on his new Firebolt broomstick. When Harry caught the snitch to win the game, the twins and the rest of the team flew together and embraced, celebrating their victory. That night, Fred and George disappeared for a couple of hours, and when they returned with armfuls of butterbeer, pumpkin fizz, and several bags of Honeyduke sweets, a huge party started in the Gryffindor common room. Angelina Johnson asked them how they pulled off getting things from Hogsmeade, and Fred whispered in Harry's ear, saying they did it with a little help from Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, the Marauders, and the creators of the map. Leading to the Quidditch final, Fred and George dealt with the pressure by being louder and more exuberant than ever. The match turned out to be very intense. Right off the bat, George ensured that the Slytherin chaser didn't score by hitting a perfect bludger at him, and this led to Angelina scoring. After she scored, however, Marcus Flint smashed right into her. This made Fred throw his beaters club at the back of Flint's head, and Flint's nose smashed into the handle of his broom and began to bleed. Later on, when the Slytherin beater hit Alicia with his club, George elbowed him in the face in retaliation. The game was played so dirty by Slytherin that it got to the point where Fred and George went on either side of Katie Bell, who had the quaffle to protect her, clubs raised. Later, Fred hit a perfect bludger at the Slytherin chaser, setting up another goal for Gryffindor, making it 70-10, meaning that they would win the cup if Harry caught the snitch. And moments later, he did just that to lead Gryffindor to a championship victory. In their 4th year on the team, the twins were finally champions. Toward the end of the school year, Fred and George were uncharacteristically studying really hard, as they had their OWL exams, the exams that 5th years take, and that play a very large role in your future career. The twins ended up taking 3 OWLs each, which was very few compared to most, but they managed to scrape up some good scores on the little that they did take. That summer, Fred and George started to develop joke props and candy, and they called their business Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. As it turned out, the explosions that were oh so common coming from the twins' room were actually them experimenting and making magical gags and joke shop merchandise. They started to make up order forms, each with a long list of stuff that they had invented, and their goal for the coming school year was to sell their stuff at Hogwarts. However, when Mrs. Weasley was cleaning out their room, she found the order forms and freaked out on them, telling them that they weren't allowed to make any more of it, and she then burned all of the order forms. Mrs. Weasley was also angry at them for how little OWLs they took. All of this led to a huge fight, Mrs. Weasley saying that she wanted them to work in the ministry like their father, but all they wanted to do was open a joke shop, which Mrs. Weasley did not approve of. Things were made worse, as Percy had just gotten a job at the ministry, and Mrs. Weasley was trying to hold the twins to Percy standards, which really annoyed Fred and George. To get back at Percy, they sent him dragon dung at his work. Percy, however, thought it was fertilizer from Norway. The twins were excited to have their older brothers Bill and Charlie home for a while, as they were all going to the Quidditch World Cup. Fred and George went with their father and Ron to pick Harry up from the Dursleys. When they got there, the twins got identical evil smiles when they saw Harry's cousin Dudley. They then purposefully spilled their experimental joke candy called Tauntaun Toffee on the ground, knowing that Dudley's fat ass would eat it, and when he did, his tongue grew to a foot long. The twins had already headed back to the burrow though, and when Harry returned, they eagerly asked if Dudley ate it, and when Harry told the twins and the other Weasley siblings what happened, they all burst out laughing. When Mr. Weasley returned though, he was not happy, saying that it wasn't funny. George then asked his father how big his tongue got, and Mr. Weasley said it was 4 feet long by the time he fixed it. Fred and George told their irritated father that they did it because he was a huge bullying gid, but Mr. Weasley said that that wasn't the point, and he began to say, "Wait until your mother hears about this," when Mrs. Weasley entered. Mrs. Weasley asked what they did this time, and said that if it had anything to do with Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, she'd be furious. This led to another big fight, but it was tamed more than the other one because they had Harry and Hermione over as guests. That night at dinner, Fred, George, and Charlie were excitedly talking about the World Cup. Fred then made fun of Percy, mentioning the dragon dung that he was sent, but Percy explained that it was fertilizer and was nothing personal, but Fred whispered to Harry that it was personal because they sent it. Fred and George woke up early the next morning to catch the portkey to the Quidditch World Cup, and before they left, Mrs. Weasley saw some of their joke candy coming out of George's pocket. She used the summoning charm, and loads of joke shop merchandise came flying out of their pockets, jackets, and all sorts of unexpected places. When Mrs. Weasley threw them away, Fred yelled that they spent 6 months developing those, and Mrs. Weasley got angry, saying it was no wonder they didn't take more OWLs. Fred and George were furious with their mother, and Mrs. Weasley was just as mad. The twins walked out the door without saying goodbye to their mother, and when she told them to behave themselves, the twins did not answer or even look back. The group met up with Cedric Diggory and his father, and everybody said hi to Cedric except for Fred and George, as they were still mad that Cedric beat them in the first Quidditch match of last year. Later that day, Fred and George met Ludo Bagman, a ministry employee who was in charge of running the World Cup, and Fred and George bet all of their savings as well as one of their fake wands that Ireland would win, but Crumb would catch the snitch. Percy immediately told his brothers that they shouldn't show Bagman their rubbish joke shop ideas, but Bagman loved it and said that he would even pay money for it. Bagman then took all of the twins' savings and wrote down their bet. Later on, they came across Percy's boss, Barty Crouch, and when he called Percy Weatherby instead of Weasley, Fred and George could not contain their laughter. Crouch then mentioned something that was happening at Hogwarts that year, and the twins asked what it was, but Percy responded saying that it was classified information, and Fred said, "Oh, shut up, Weatherby." Fred and George were able to watch the match in the Minister of Magic's box, and there, they watched as Victor Crumb caught the snitch, but Ireland won, the very scenario they had bet all their savings on. Fred and George immediately went up to Ludo Bagman with broad grins on their faces and their hands outstretched, and Bagman gave them their gold. Mr. Weasley later told the twins not to tell their mother they'd been gambling, and Fred responded saying that they wouldn't, as they had big plans for that money and didn't want their mother to confiscate it. Later that night, a group of former Death Eaters went on a rampage in the campsite, and Fred grabbed his younger sister's hand and pulled her to safety in the woods, and George soon followed. They came back when it was safe, unhurt but shaken, and the twins discussed what happened with their siblings, their father, Harry, and Hermione. When they returned home to the burrow, a puffy-eyed Mrs. Weasley ran to Fred and George and gave them a huge hug. She told them that she was so sorry, and that all she could think about was that they could have died last night, and the last thing she would have said to them was that they didn't get enough OWLs. When they were back home, the twins realized that the gold Bagman had given them was leprechaun gold, meaning it disappeared after a few hours, and the twins thought that Bagman had made a mistake. The night before going back to Hogwarts, Fred and George sat together in a far corner and were whispering about what they should say in their letter to Ludo Bagman to get the real gold and the money that they had given him, which was all of their savings. When Mrs. Weasley accused them of making new order forms for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, Fred jokingly asked how she would feel if the Hogwarts Express crashed, and the last thing she said to them was an unfounded accusation, and this made everyone laugh, including Mrs. Weasley. On platform 9 3/4, Charlie, Bill, and Mrs. Weasley all hinted that something was happening at Hogwarts, but refused to tell them, and as the train started moving, Fred stuck his head out the window and asked what was happening. When they got to school, Dumbledore announced that they would be hosting the Triwizard tournament, and Fred cried out, "You're joking!" And everyone in the Great Hall burst out laughing, including Dumbledore, and he assured Fred that he was not joking. When Dumbledore told them that the prize was 1,000 galleons, Fred whispered to the Gryffindor table saying that he was going for it. However, he was disappointed when the headmaster said that there was an age limit and you had to be 17 years old. Dumbledore then looked directly at Fred and George during his speech and said that no one should waste their time trying to get in if they weren't old enough. This, however, did not throw Fred and George off, and they immediately started planning on how to get past Dumbledore's defenses, but they didn't know what it was yet. During class, George asked McGonagall how the champions were chosen, but she told him to shut up and get on with transfiguring. Fred and George ended up loving the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor Mad-Eye Moody, at least who everybody thought was Moody. After their first lesson with him, the twins along with Lee Jordan explained to Harry and Ron how cool he was, as he really knew what it was like to fight the dark arts. One night while in the common room, the twins were once again sitting over a parchment of paper writing a letter to Ludo Bagman, who still had not paid them after giving them the leprechaun gold, and Harry noted that this was quite unlike them, as they usually like to be in the thick of things, being noisy and the center of attention. Fred wrote something down, but George shook his head and scribbled what he had written out, saying that that sounded too much like they were accusing him, and they had to be careful. Later on, the twins sat alone at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall, and Fred said gloomily that it was a bummer that it had come to this, but that if Bagman refused to answer their letter, they'd stuff it into his hand in person because he couldn't avoid them that way. Ron then came over, and hearing the end of the sentence, he asked who was avoiding them, and Fred said he wished Ron was. Hermione then started talking to the twins about SPEW, her initiative to help free the house elves. George cut her off though and asked if she had ever been down in the kitchens, and when she said no, George said that they had many times to nick food, and he explained that the house elves down in the kitchens were really happy, thinking they had the best job in the world. When Dumbledore finally announced that it was an age line that would stop those that were underage from entering the tournament, Fred and George got excited, saying that a simple aging potion would fool that. The next day, Fred, George, and Lee Jordan all took aging potion. With everyone watching, Fred was the first one to hop past the age line, and George, thinking it had worked, yelled in triumph and followed his brother. However, both twins were then shot backwards and sprouted long white beards. Everyone burst out laughing, and when Fred and George looked at each other's beards, they too began to crack up. Dumbledore then came up behind them and said in an amused voice that he had warned them, and he told them to go up to the hospital wing, joining a few other students who had tried to age themselves as well, but Dumbledore said that none of their beards were as magnificent as the twins. The twins made their way to Madame Pomfrey, joined by Lee Jordan, who couldn't stop laughing at his best friends. The twins took their disappointment well, and Fred said that he hoped his fellow Gryffindor teammate Angelina Johnson was the one chosen. Ultimately, Cedric Diggory was chosen, which the twins were not happy about, but on top of that, Harry was chosen. Afterwards, Fred and George told Harry that he should have told them he entered, saying this half annoyed and half deeply impressed. After the first task, Fred and George stole some food from the kitchens to celebrate Harry's victory, and during the party, Hermione asked how they got into the kitchens. Fred told her the secret of tickling the pear to open the portrait entrance, but he then stopped and suspiciously asked why she wanted to know. When he realized it was for SPEW, George told her not to put anything about wages in the house elf's head. Just then, Neville turned into a canary after eating one of Fred and George's custard creams, and when he turned back, everyone, including Neville, started laughing. Fred then cried out that he and George invented them, saying they were 7 sickles each, which was a bargain. After the Yule Ball was announced, Fred and George approached Ron and Harry in the common room and asked them if they had dates yet, and Ron told them no. Fred then told them that they better hurry up or all the good ones would be taken. When Ron asked who he was taking, Fred told him Angelina Johnson without a trace of embarrassment. Ron prompted if he had asked her, and Fred said that was a good point. He turned and yelled across the common room to Angelina and asked her to the Yule Ball. She said yes with a big grin on her face, and Fred turned back to Harry and Ron saying it was a piece of cake. Fred and George's Canary cream sales skyrocketed, and because of them, people kept sprouting feathers just as Neville had. George confided in Harry, saying that he and Fred were developing something else similar. During the Yule Ball, Fred went with Angelina, and George asked another girl to go with him. Fred and Angelina danced wildly on the dance floor, so wildly in fact that people had to back up in fear of getting injured. Later on during the ball, Fred and George cornered Ludo Bagman, trying to get the money he owed them, but Bagman shook the twins off quickly and used spotting Harry as a distraction. One day while in Hogsmeade, the twins once again cornered Bagman, this time in the 3 broomsticks, and they offered to buy him a drink. Bagman blew them off though, leaving Fred and George very disappointed. The twins were starting to get very frustrated with Bagman for not giving them the money they earned or the money that they had given him, which was all of their savings. And as they were walking to the Allery, they were going over their new letter. Fred said that what George had written was blackmail and they could get in a lot of trouble for that, but George said that they had tried being polite and it was time to play dirty, but Fred still said that they shouldn't put that in writing. George responded saying that he wouldn't be complaining if they got their nice fat payoff though. When they opened the door to the Allery, Ron, Harry, and Hermione were there, and they stopped talking immediately. When Ron asked who they were blackmailing, they told him they were only joking, but when Ron kept at it, George shut him up by threatening to break his nose. On April 1st, Fred and George turned of age in the Wizarding World, being 17 years old. This meant that they were allowed to take their apparating test, and they both passed on their first try. Before the third task, Mrs. Weasley and Bill came to support Harry, and Fred and George joined the two of them, Harry, Hermione, and the rest of their siblings at dinner. The twins sought Ludo Bagman out that night, once again trying to get the gold they were owed, but Bagman turned nasty, saying that they were too young to gamble and that he wasn't giving them anything. Hearing this, the twins decided it wasn't worth it and they gave up. On the train ride home, Fred and George saw Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle heading toward the trio's compartment, so they followed them. Seeing them lift their wands, both Fred and George shot spells at the 3 of them at the same time as Harry, Ron, and Hermione. The effect was that they all fell to the ground unmoving. Fred stepped on Goyle as he entered the compartment, admiring the work that the 5 of them had just done. They then kicked, rolled, and pushed the 3 of them out of the compartment and shut the door. When Ron asked who they were blackmailing, the twins told him about Ludo Bagman, but also said that they had given up. They then told Ron that Lee Jordan's father had some trouble getting money from Bagman as well, and as it turned out, he was in big trouble with the goblins after borrowing loads of gold from them. The goblins cornered him at the World Cup and took everything he had, including Fred and George's money, and that was the reason why he couldn't pay them. When the train arrived at King's Cross, Harry told Fred and George to hang back, and he gave them the 1,000 galleons he had gotten for winning the Triwizard tournament. They did not accept it at first, but when Harry said that if they didn't take it, it was going down the drain, they took it, so grateful to Harry. Harry then made them promise not to tell their mom where they had gotten the money to start their joke shop business, and they agreed. That summer, Fred, George, and the rest of the Weasleys spent the holiday at the Order of the Phoenix headquarters at number 12 Grimmauld Place, as Arthur and Molly were heavily involved in the Order. While there, the twins started to use the money that Harry had given them to invent more joke shop ideas, including extendable ears, which came in handy when eavesdropping on the Order meetings. However, when Mrs. Weasley found out about them, she went berserk and threw any that she found out, so Fred and George had to hide them and be more careful about when they used them. Now being of age, Fred and George were able to use magic outside of school, and this meant they could develop their joke shop merchandise in a much easier and more precise way. They also took to apparating and disapparating anywhere they went, which annoyed their mother to no end. The twins made a number of new inventions that summer. One was an entire box full of joke sweets to get you out of class. One thing in the box was called puking pastels that were double-sided. One side would make you puke so you could leave class, and the other half would make you feel back to normal. However, they had not perfected it yet, and themselves being the testers of all their inventions, they had some problems. They would puke so much that they were unable to even eat the other end to make it stop. The two took turns testing, ensuring that the other could help if something went really wrong. For other candies in the box, they also tested fainting fancies and nosebleed nougats. After testing the nosebleed nougats, Mrs. Weasley thought that the two of them had been dueling because of their bloody noses. The worst part about the nosebleed nougat though was that they hadn't found an antidote, and this meant that they would just keep bleeding and bleeding without putting a stop to it. During their summer break, Fred and George were enjoying doing their joke shop so much that they seriously considered not going back for their 7th and final year at Hogwarts. They both felt that their futures lay outside the world of academic achievement. However, they decided to go because they didn't think their mother could take them leaving school early, especially after what happened with Percy that summer. Percy had turned his back on the family, taking the ministry side above his own parents and siblings, and Fred and George were furious with their older brother. Toward the end of the summer, Harry arrived at Grimmauld Place, and when it was time for dinner, Fred and George used magic to carry all of the food and utensils to the table, and as Mrs. Weasley yelled at them, the drinks fell to the floor, the pot of stew burned through the table, and a knife landed on the table right where Sirius's hand had just been. Mrs. Weasley then exploded at them, telling them that they didn't have to use magic for everything. During dinner, Fred and George were cracking up at Mundungus Fletcher's story of ripping people off until Mrs. Weasley cut Mundungus off, not wanting her boys to end up like crooks like he was. Later on during dinner, Fred and George wanted to stay for the serious order talk that Harry was staying for, and Mrs. Weasley tried to send them away, but Mr. Weasley told his wife that they were of age and she couldn't make that decision for them. They had to make it. When the conversation got too intense though, Mrs. Weasley put a stop to it and sent Fred, George, and all the other kids to bed. After going to bed though, Fred and George apparated into Harry and Ron's room, and they all discussed what they had talked about downstairs. While cleaning the house the next morning, they were getting rid of doxies, and Fred pocketed a handful of them, telling Harry that they wanted to experiment with doxy venom for their skiving snack boxes. They then told Harry that they had not had a chance to find a location for their joke shop yet, so they were running a mail order service. They had even put ads in the Daily Prophet the week before, which they knew Mrs. Weasley would not see because she swore the Prophet off. After Harry had his trial and was cleared of all charges, Fred, George, and Ginny started chanting, "He got off! He got off!" When Ron became a prefect, Mrs. Weasley exclaimed that that was everybody in the family, with Bill, Charlie, Percy, and now Ron, and Fred and George indignantly said, "What are we, next door neighbors?" The twins gave Ron a very hard time about being made a prefect, and even patted Harry on the back for not being one. Later on, Fred and George invited Harry over to their meeting with Mundungus, telling Mundungus that Harry was their financial backer, and Mundungus showed them the illegal venomous tentaculus seeds he had gotten for the twins, which they told Harry they needed for their skiving snack boxes. The next morning when leaving for King's Cross, Fred and George decided to use magic to carry their trunks down the stairs, and they ended up hitting Ginny, knocking her down 2 flights of stairs. Mrs. Weasley was furious with the twins as she patched Ginny up. When they got to Hogwarts, Fred and George were not fond of the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher Dolores Umbridge. She was a cruel woman, and right off the bat, she gave the twins multiple detentions. These were no ordinary detentions though. She had them write lines with a special quill which cut their hands and wrote on the paper with their own blood. In the Gryffindor common room, Fred and George posted a notice up recruiting people to be testers for their new inventions, but Hermione, who was now a prefect, scolded them and made them take it down. Though Fred and George had seriously considered not coming back for their 7th year, they decided to make the most of it, using the year as a bit of market research, finding out exactly what the average Hogwarts student required from a joke shop, carefully evaluating their results, and figuring out what products to produce based on that research. That night in the common room, Fred, George, along with Lee Jordan, handed out experimental fainting fancies to first years, and as all of them fainted, Hermione marched over and yelled at them. As Lee put the other side in the first year's mouths to wake them up, they asked the kids how they felt, and all of them said that they were okay, meaning it was a successful trial. However, Hermione snapped again, saying that the first years could have gotten really ill, but the twins said that they wouldn't because they already did the bulk of testing on themselves to make sure it was safe. Fred and George then mocked Hermione, asking if she was going to put them in detention, but instead, she said she was going to write to their mother. Fred and George thought this was a low blow, but it forced them to stop testing on other students in the common room. However, they continued to test their stuff on first years outside the common room where Hermione wouldn't see. When it came time for the Quidditch season, Fred and George were joined on the team by Ron, who was the new keeper, and right away, they noticed that he had confidence issues, which made him choke pretty often. The twins exchanged looks when Ron dropped an easy ball at practice, but uncharacteristically, neither of them said anything, not wanting to hurt their brother's confidence even more. Ron later gave Katie Bell a nosebleed, and Fred gave her one of their nosebleed nougats, but he accidentally gave her the wrong end, making her bleed even more. She turned chalk white, about to fall off her broom when everybody rushed toward her, and Fred and George took her to the hospital wing. Fred and George were two of many people that came to the trio's meeting in Hogsmeade, and Fred and George used their newfound fortune from selling all of their merchandise to buy everybody there a butterbeer. After Harry gave his speech, a boy named Zacharias Smith made a rude comment, and George pulled out a long, lethal-looking metal instrument and threatened to hit him. Fred was the first one to sign his name to join the club where Harry would teach them magic, and George soon followed by the rest of the people there. One night in the common room, Fred and George, having finally perfected one of their skiving snack boxes, took turns demonstrating them to a crowd of cheering people, and afterwards, they took a huge number of orders and money from fellow Gryffindors. Before practice on a rainy, gross day, Fred and George debated using their own puking pastels to get out of practice, but they knew that Angelina, the new captain of the team, would know what they had done because they tried to sell her some. George then said that they could try the fever fudge, as no one had seen that yet, and overhearing this, Ron asked if it worked. Fred said it did, but that it caused massive pus-filled boils that they hadn't figured out how to get rid of. When Ron said that he didn't see any boils, Fred and George said that that was because they were somewhere that made flying a broomstick very painful. After hours on the broom during practice, Fred said that some of his might have erupted, and George said that his hadn't, but rather got bigger and were now throbbing. Fred and George attended the first DA meeting in the Room of Requirement, and they played a prank on Zacharias Smith, disarming him anytime he opened his mouth, and when Harry caught them, they apologized laughing, saying that they couldn't resist. After a Quidditch match where Gryffindor had just barely beaten Slytherin, Malfoy was talking trash while on the ground. After insulting Mr. Weasley, the twins gave him a dirty look, but Angela told them to leave it. However, when Malfoy continued to insult their family, Harry held George back while it took the combined effort of Angelina, Alicia, and Katie to hold Fred back. Then when Malfoy insulted Harry's mother, Harry released George and the two of them beat the crap out of Malfoy, punching him in the face repeatedly. Madam Hooch blasted both of them off with a spell, and Malfoy was curled up on the ground whimpering and moaning. George had gotten hit himself when Malfoy was trying desperately to defend himself, and he had a swollen lip. Meanwhile, Fred was still being forcibly restrained by the three girls. George and Harry were ordered to go to McGonagall's office, and when they got there, she scolded them both. She gave them each a week's worth of detention, and Dolores Umbridge then entered the room. Umbridge said that they deserved more than just detentions, and she banned George and Harry from playing Quidditch ever again. She then said that she was banning Fred as well, because had the girls not restrained him, he would have attacked Malfoy as well. She confiscated all three of their broomsticks, and that was the end of it. Later on, when talking with the team, they were all furious. Katie saying banning Fred when he didn't do anything was very unfair, but Fred then piped up and said that if they hadn't held him back, he would have pounded the little scumbag to a pulp. Fred and George went off to bed in a terrible mood that night. They got over it fast though, and the next day, they were bewitching snowballs to hit the windows of the castle. Ron then stuck his head out the window, saying that he was a prefect, and that if one more snowball was thrown, but he was cut off because Fred and George nailed him in the face. The night before Christmas holiday, Fred, George, and Ginny were taken to Dumbledore's office where they were told that Harry had seen their father get terribly injured. Dumbledore sent all of them to Grimmauld Place using a portkey that night, and when they got there, Harry explained everything he had seen to the Weasley children and Sirius. Fred, George, and Ginny immediately said that they wanted to go to St. Mungo's Hospital, but Sirius said no, which made Fred and George angry. Sirius then said that their father was on order duty and he knew what he had signed up for. When the twins gave him an angry look, Sirius Sirius told them that this is why they weren't in the order, because they didn't understand that some things were worth dying for. Fred furiously responded, saying that that was easy for him to say because he spent all his time here unable to leave, and he added that he didn't see Sirius risking his own neck. Sirius looked like he wanted to hit Fred for saying this, but he gathered himself and convinced them to drop it and have a butterbeer. They then got a letter from their mother, and George ripped it open and read out loud that their father was alive, and their mother told them to stay where they were. George looked up, horror-struck, and said, "Still alive? But that makes it sound..." But he couldn't finish the thought, as he and his siblings knew that their father was hovering somewhere between life and death. They all sat at the table waiting for bad news, and at 5 in the morning, Mrs. Weasley arrived saying that Arthur was going to be alright, and she said that they could visit him later that day. Hearing this, Fred fell back into his chair with his hands over his face, so relieved, and George got up to hug his mother. Later that day, they all went to visit their father at St. Mungo's, and Arthur assured his kids that he was absolutely fine. On Christmas, the twins comforted their mother when she was crying about Percy sending a sweater back, but unfortunately, it didn't work. During the remainder of Christmas break, they visited their father again, and when he finally came home, the twins were very relieved and happy to have their father back, happy and healthy. When back at school, Fred and George demonstrated their latest joke shop merchandise in the common room. They showed headless hats, which made the wearer's head disappear, something that impressed Hermione, saying that that was a hard bit of magic to pull off. After watching a Gryffindor Quidditch practice, the twins told Harry and Hermione that Quidditch was the only thing worth staying for at this school, and when Hermione said that they had exams coming up, Fred told her that they had no need for any WTs. Fred and George knew it was almost time to leave, and they began to plan. When a Slytherin named Montague tried to dock Fred and George house points, they pushed him into a vanishing cabinet before he could get the words out, and Fred and George laughed about this, saying that it could take weeks for him to turn up again. After telling the trio this, they said that they didn't care about getting into trouble anymore. When Hermione asked if they ever did, George said of course, because they'd never been expelled. They told them that they knew where the line was, and George said that they might have put a tub across it occasionally, but Fred said that they'd always stop short of causing real mayhem. The twins then said that now that Dumbledore was gone and had been replaced by Umbridge, it was time for some real mayhem. Hermione said that they could be expelled, and the twins laughed, saying that they didn't care about staying at Hogwarts anymore. They said that they would walk out right now if they weren't determined to do their bit for Dumbledore first. Later that day, the twins set off an enormous crate of enchanted fireworks that they had made, shaking the whole castle. The twins had made them so that instead of fading away or fizzing out, the fireworks gained in energy and momentum. They ended up being spread throughout the entire school, and when Harry joined them, he said that they would put Dr. Filibuster out of business no problem. Umbridge spent the day trying to take control of the fireworks, but with no luck, and when she tried vanishing them, Fred and George had made it so they would multiply instead. The twins were heroes that night in the Gryffindor common room, and even Hermione said that they were wonderful fireworks. George said that they were called Weasley's Wildfire Whiz-Bangs, but said that they used their whole stock, but the twins agreed it was worth it. The twins made a waiting list for people to buy their fireworks, and almost everybody in the common room signed up. During Easter break, the twins didn't want to disrupt leisure time, so they didn't pull any stunts for the week. But when break was over and Ginny told them that Harry wanted to talk to Sirius, they knew that they could help. They had the ultimate distraction, causing absolute chaos. But this time, Umbridge knew it was the twins. With a whole crowd of students watching, she had the twins cornered. Umbridge angrily said that it was not amusing to turn a school corridor into a swamp, but Fred said it was amusing, looking at Umbridge without the slightest sign of fear. Umbridge then called Filch forward to whip the two of them as punishment. Fred looked at George and said that they'd outgrown full-time education, and George agreed. They said it was time to take their talents elsewhere, and they used the summoning charm to get their brooms from Umbridge's office. When they got their brooms, they said that they would not be seeing Umbridge, told her not to bother keeping in touch, and told the crowd of students that if they wanted to buy a portable swamp, come to their new premises at number 93 in Diagon Alley, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. They said that there would be special discounts to Hogwarts students who swore to use those products to get rid of this old bat, referring to Umbridge. Fred looked at Peeves the Poltergeist and told him to give Umbridge hell for them, and after Peeves saluted them, Fred and George flew off to a huge applause from the students below. After doing this, Fred and George would go down in history as legends at Hogwarts. The chaos that they had caused was around for a long time even after they left, as Umbridge could not figure out how to get rid of the swamp. People who were inspired by Fred and George's example also pulled all sorts of pranks to upset Umbridge, and Peeves did exactly as he was told, giving Umbridge hell. Their joke candy was also all over the school, as they had sold a ton of it before leaving, and kids used them to get out of class, especially Umbridge's, which annoyed her to no end. At the end of the school year, Flitwick finally got rid of the swamp, but he left a small bit of it as a monument to Fred and George because he thought it was a great bit of magic. Fred and George opened their joke shop in Diagon Alley, and business was through the roof. The store stuck out like a fireworks display compared to the other stores in Diagon Alley. People walking by would look over their shoulders, and some would even come to a halt, transfixed by the incredible joke shop. They had a crazy inventory full of original and genius ideas full of jokes, pranks, and fun. They got so big that they even had to hire a staff to help run the shop. When the school year ended, the twins went to King's Cross Station to pick everybody up, and when Ron commented on their new jackets, they told him that they were the finest dragon skin, and said that because business was booming, they thought they'd treat themselves. Even though Mrs. Weasley was against the joke shop at first, she ended up being impressed, and even admitted that the twins had a flair for business. The twins moved out of the burrow and moved into the flat above the joke shop, meaning they had more time to work on stuff for the store. The twins ended up using their old room in the burrow as storage space for the store, turning it into a sort of warehouse. One thing that Fred and George created were shield hats. They noticed how many people struggled with shield charms, and thought it would be funny to have a friend hit you with the hat on, only to have it bounce back and hit them. But when the ministry found out about them, they bought 500 of them from Fred and George for the workers that went out in the field. Seeing their success, they started working on shield cloaks, gloves, and much more. They also moved on to make more Defense Against the Dark Arts merchandise, like instant darkness powder, decoy detonators, and much more. When their family along with Harry and Hermione came to visit for the first time, they were very impressed. When Fred spotted Hermione looking at an automatic daydream product, something that she said was an extraordinary piece of magic, he told her that she could have it for free. Fred then gave Harry a tour of the shop, and when they met up with George, they took Harry to the back. There they told Harry that he could help himself to anything he wanted, free of charge, because he was the one who gave them the startup money, something that the twins told him they had not forgotten. They then showed off their Wonder Witch collection, which included love potions that Ginny was looking at. They said that she didn't need it though, and asked Ginny about her love life, which Ron had told them about.
Are you not currently dating Dean Thomas?
It's none of your business.
Ginny went on to buy a pygmy puff, another one of the twins' brilliant inventions, and they told everybody that they were having trouble breeding the pygmy puffs fast enough to keep them on the shelves. Argus Filch ended up banning all Weasley's Wizard Wheezes products that year, but as always, the twins found a way around this. With their owl order service, they started sending packages of their merchandise disguised as perfumes and cough potions. During Christmas break, the twins spent some time at the burrow, and when in the garden, a gnome bit Fred, so he stupefied it, and he, George, Ron, and Harry put it at the top of the Christmas tree in place of the angel. Later on, they made fun of Ron for having to do chores without magic, as he wasn't of age yet. They then asked Ron about the girl he was dating named Lavender Brown, something that Ginny had told them about, and they joked, asking what extensive brain damage made her want to date Ron. When their mother entered, Fred asked if Percy was showing his ugly face, and she sadly said no, which made Fred say that he was the world's biggest prat. The twins then left, saying that they were entertaining a pretty muggle girl who was impressed with their magic tricks, almost as if it was real magic. On Christmas, Fred and George bought their mom a new diamond-encrusted hat, which she loved. Later that day, Percy showed up with the Minister of Magic, and the twins knew that he was only there so that the minister could talk to Harry. Fred, George, and Ginny were furious with their brother, and they ended up throwing food at Percy, prompting him to storm out angrily. On Ron's birthday, Fred and George headed to Hogsmeade to surprise their brother, and while there, they went into Zonko's joke shop as they were considering buying the place to have a Hogsmeade branch. Ron never made it to Hogsmeade though because he was poisoned, and luckily he was okay, but he was still pretty out of it. When the twins came to visit him in the hospital wing, they said that this wasn't how they imagined giving Ron his present. The twins returned to Hogwarts at the end of the school year when again one of their siblings was badly hurt. This time it was Bill, who was mauled by a werewolf named Greyback. They also heard about the death of Albus Dumbledore that night, and they mourned him with their family and a few other order members. To the relief of the twins and everyone else, their brother was okay, but Bill would have permanent scars on his face. Having been so busy with the shop, the twins did not join the order straight away, but they joined the summer after Dumbledore's death, and their first mission as members was to get Harry from his aunt and uncle's house. Themselves and 4 others took Polyjuice Potion to turn into Harry.
Wow, we're identical.
When Moody was assigning all of the Harrys to order members, the twins told Mad-Eye that he mixed them up, saying he couldn't even tell them apart when they looked like Harry, but they then said that they were joking, the same joke that we saw them do in their first appearance in the first book. Fred was paired with his father, and George was paired with Lupin. When they all flew away, they realized it was a trap, and they were all ambushed. During the battle in the sky, Snape hit George with a Sectum Sempra curse, and George was hit in the ear, cutting it straight off. Lupin had to hold a semi-unconscious George as he flew, knowing that George was losing a ton of blood. Luckily, they made it to their destination and took a portkey to the burrow. When they arrived, Lupin held George up, and Harry ran over to help as well to take him inside. It soon became clear that George would not have an ear for the rest of his life because it was cursed off with dark magic. Mrs. Weasley was able to stop the bleeding, and she wiped the blood away to reveal a hole in George's head where his ear should have been. Mrs. Weasley was upset, but she said that it could have been much worse, and she was so relieved that he was alive. When Fred and Mr. Weasley arrived, the two ran to see George, and when Fred was in front of his twin brother, he was uncharacteristically at a loss for words until George made a joke.
I'm holy, Fred. Get it?
The whole wide world of ear-related humour, and you go for I'm holy. It's pathetic.
George then looked at his mom and jokingly said that at least now she could tell them apart. The twins were present for Bill and Fleur's wedding, which took place at the Burrow, and when some Vila cousins of Fleur arrived, Fred cut George off and he escorted them inside, leaving the middle-aged and elderly women for George to escort in. During the actual wedding, Fred wolf whistled, which started an outbreak of laughter from the Vila girls he was trying to impress earlier. Later in the night, Fred and George disappeared into the night with the pair of Fleur's Vila cousins. Death Eaters ended up crashing the wedding, and the twins and the rest of the Weasley family were held for questioning, but ultimately they were let go. When the Ministry fell, Fred joined in on the radio broadcast for the rebels called Potter Watch, and he told everybody to calm down, saying that panic wasn't going to solve anything. Then, joking about a rumor that Voldemort could kill with his eyes, Fred said that that was a basilisk, not Voldemort, and the easy way to tell them apart was to see if they had legs. He then ended it, saying not to have a false sense of security because Voldemort was out of the country, because he could move faster than Severus Snape when confronted with shampoo. After Ron was spotted with Harry, the twins and the rest of the Weasley family had to go into hiding, meaning Fred and George couldn't run their joke shop anymore, at least not in the store. They all stayed with their Aunt Muriel, and Fred and George were driving her crazy, especially with the two of them running their out-order business from her home. When it came time for the final battle, Fred, George, and Lee Jordan all arrived at Hogwarts together, and the twins had brought their little sister Ginny with them, all of them ready to fight. Mrs. Weasley asked what they were thinking bringing Ginny, as she was underage and too young to fight, and the twins looked ashamed of themselves, realizing what they had done. Percy then showed up, and he apologized to his family. Fred said that he was a ministry-loving, family-disowning, power-hungry moron, and when Percy said that he agreed with everything he said, Fred held out his hand to his older brother, and they made up. George forgave Percy as well, and he jokingly said that they did look to their prefix at times like these, and he finished saying that they better go and fight before all of the good Death Eaters were taken. Fred and George were told to organize defenses at every passageway into the school, as they knew more about the school grounds than almost anybody else, and they said that that was the job for them. Fred and George ended up getting separated during the battle, and Fred and Percy were fighting Death Eaters side by side. When Percy made a joke, Fred began to say that Percy was joking, and he hadn't heard him joke since. But he couldn't finish his sentence. The wall next to them had exploded, and the impact hit Fred full on, killing him instantly. As Percy and Ron stood over him, screaming in absolute agony and sadness, Fred's eyes stared without seeing, the ghost of his last laugh still etched upon his face. Percy lay across Fred's body, shielding him from further harm, and even when Harry told Percy to run, he shook his head, saying that he could not leave his brother. Only when Harry began to move Fred's body did Percy get off of him and help, and they pushed him out of the way of the battle. During a break in the battle, Fred's body was moved to the Great Hall with all of the other fallen soldiers, and the Weasley family stood over Fred's lifeless body. George was sitting by Fred's head, tears falling down his face, beyond devastated to lose his twin brother. He was his partner in crime, his best friend, the person he was closest with.
You okay, Freddy?
Yeah. Me too.
When the battle raged on, George fought back harder than ever, fueled by grief, and he slammed Yaxley to the floor with the help of Lee Jordan. George then watched Harry reveal himself and kill Voldemort, ending the fight once and for all. George never truly got over Fred's death. He mourned his twin brother, and to continue Fred's legacy, he kept the joke shop open, running it by himself, and for a short time with the help of Ron. It had the same amount of success as before, giving George a pretty big fortune, but it just wasn't the same without Fred. George went on to marry Angelina Johnson, the girl that Fred had taken to the Yule Ball. Something about the two of them being together made Fred's death less painful for them because they had each other. The two went on to have 2 children, a son who they named Fred Weasley II in honor of Fred, and they had a daughter who they named Roxanne. For the 2014 Quidditch World Cup, George and Angelina took their kids to watch, and Rita Skeeter mentioned them in her article saying, George Weasley, one-eared co-owner of the joke shop Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, was seen putting on a show of family togetherness up in a box with wife Angelina Johnson and children Fred and Roxanne. George's new family made the pain of losing Fred wither down a bit, but Fred was such a huge part of his life that there was always a hole in his heart. Fred and George's presence always put a smile on everyone's face whenever things were too serious or too intense. They were the light in the darkness, especially with their joke shop, dedicating their lives to making people laugh and have fun. They are some of the most likable characters in Harry Potter, and in the end, one of the most tragic. Fred did not deserve to die, and George did not deserve to lose his twin brother, but the time that the two shared with each other was unforgettable. Thank you so much for watching, guys. You can follow me on social media to see more of my personal life and more of this little dude. If you like this video, hit that like button and subscribe. I want to give a huge shout out to all my patrons listed below. If you want to be featured on the next video, plus get a bunch of other rewards, become a patron today. Again, thank you so much for watching, and look out for more great Movie Flame videos on the way.